Welcome to episode 3 of our series on business cycles. We leave the world of static limitations and introduce the ultimate internal force that drives all evolution: innovation.
And this is a really foundational deep dive we're getting into today. We're moving, I think, pretty definitively beyond that world of equilibrium analysis that we spent so much time on before.
Right. Before we were looking at the rules of the game, today we're talking about the player who comes in and just flips the whole board over.
Exactly. We're looking at the engine that actually rewrites the rules from the inside.
So our mission today is ambitious, but I think we can break it down. We need to explain the absolute core of Joseph Schumpeter's dynamic theory, how capitalism changes itself. And that means we're going to have to look at, really, 3 key parts.
3 pieces. First, the agent of change.
The entrepreneur.
Then the process itself.
The innovation.
And, maybe, most importantly, the fuel that makes it all possible.
Which is credit.
Right. We're pulling all this straight from his major work, The Theory of Economic Development, mostly from Chapter 3. But before we can really unleash this disruptive force, we have to set the stage. We have to know what it is the entrepreneur is disrupting.
We have to establish the baseline, and that baseline is the concept we touched on before, the circular flow. It's a fascinating idea because it describes an economy that is, on one hand, perfectly efficient, but on the other, completely stagnant.
Utterly stagnant. It's a model of perfect repetition. In the circular flow, all economic activity is just, guided by what's already known. All the data, the resources, the wants, the processes, they're fixed.
Nothing new happens?
Nothing. The whole system just aims for this equilibrium position, and all production just repeats automatically year after year. There's no need for new leadership, and critically, there is no net profit for the entrepreneur.
It sounds like a kind of economic clockwork. Everything is just prescribed. You have managers, of course, but they're just executing a routine.
That's the perfect word for it, routine. They maintain, they don't innovate. And Schumpeter has a specific French phrase for the person running a business in this state.
Oh, right. The entrepreneur faisant ni bénéfice ni perte.
Which literally means the entrepreneur making neither profit nor loss. And that's key. This person is basically just a salaried administrator. Their job is totally repetitive. They order the same stuff, manage the same workers, produce the same output in the same way.
And because everything in the system is already perfectly priced based on all the input costs, there's no surplus. There's nothing left over to skim off as profit.
Exactly. So, if you're a baker in the circular flow, you are absolutely sure of your ground. You know your flour costs, you know the price you can sell your bread for, and your output is totally predictable.
But that stability is based on something he calls Weiser's principle of continuity. What exactly is that?
It's really just the idea that economic activity tends to cling as tightly as possible to what's familiar, to what's habitual. Habit replaces any need for novelty.
So there's no risk-taking, no need for forecasting or creativity.
Why would you need it? The past is a perfect guide to the future in this world, and that's our baseline. A stable, zero-profit, completely familiar system where everyone is just following the script written by existing demand. Now, we're us. Let's introduce the force that rips that script to pieces.
Okay, so when we look at an economy, any economy, over time we obviously see change. But Schumpeter is insistent, right? We have to immediately separate 2 very different kinds of change: growth and development.
And he argues that only one of them is truly dynamic.
Why is this distinction so important to him?
It's not just academic, it's everything. If you confuse these 2, you completely miss the root cause of the business cycle. You miss the engine of the boom and the bust.
So let's start with the one that doesn't cause all the trouble. Growth. How does he define it?
Growth it's a continuous change. It's when the economic data changes in a way that the increment, or the decrement, can be currently absorbed by the system without perceptible disturbance. The system just adapts smoothly.
It's evolution, not revolution.
A perfect way to put it. His classic example is population increase.
Right. A few more people every year.
Exactly. If the labor supply goes up by, say, 2 or 3% a year, the system can handle that. You need a few more tools, a few more houses, a bit more food. But the fundamental way you produce things doesn't have to change.
So if that were the only thing happening, the economy would just get bigger but not different. It would be a smooth upward curve.
Monotonic, smooth, non-disruptive. You're just scaling up what you already have. Now, development. That's the one that matters for his theory.
And this one comes from within the system.
Yes, that's critical. Development is change that arises from the system's own initiative, from within. It's spontaneous, it's internal. and it creates an irreversible historical change. It's characterized by these new combinations that show up discontinuously.
Meaning you can't break them down into tiny little
You
steps.
can't. They are leaps. They are not a series of small adjustments. And this is where that famous analogy he uses really makes it clear.
The mail coach versus the railway.
The mail coach versus the railway. You can add more and more mail coaches. You can make them bigger, faster, more luxurious. That is continuous growth.
But no matter how many you add.
You will never, by simply adding more coaches, end up with a railway system. The railway is a totally new combination. It uses steel, steam power, land awe. It uses existing resources in a completely different way to create a new function that just shatters the old structure.
And that discontinuity, that leap, is what allows for profit. Because if you could do it in tiny steps, everyone would just copy you instantly and the profit would disappear.
That's it. If building a railway could be decomposed into 1,000 tiny, predictable steps, the manager in the circular flow could just adapt to each one. There'd be no disruption, no extraordinary profit. The fact that it cannot be broken down means it requires this extraordinary effort, this leap, and that's what creates the temporary competitive advantage.
What I find so interesting here is how determined he is to exclude external factors, especially when it comes to consumer tastes. I mean, most economic models we learn about start with demand. People want new things, so producers make them. Schumpeter just flips that on its head.
He completely inverts it. He looks at a spontaneous change in consumer wants as just a change in the data. It's an external disturbance. It's like an earthquake or a war. It's a shock that the system has to react to, but it doesn't explain the internal dynamism of capitalism itself.
But isn't that a little, I don't know, dismissive of the consumer? I mean, doesn't he risk downplaying real human needs and desires by saying the producer has to educate them?
It's a fair point, and it's probably his most provocative claim in this area. He argues that, fundamentally, the spontaneity of wants is actually quite small.
Really?
Think about it. Once our basic needs are met, we are creatures of habit. We're generally pretty content to buy the same things in the same ways. The big changes, the revolutions don't happen because millions of people woke up one day and said, I desperately need a personal computer.
Right. It's that someone figured out how to actually make a personal computer possible and affordable.
Exactly. The insight is that innovations don't usually happen because new wants arise spontaneously in consumers. It's the producer who initiates the change. The producer develops a new product, and then consumers are, in his words, educated by him, if necessary, to want it and fit it into their lives.
The invention of the car didn't satisfy a pre-existing demand for cars. It created the desire for personal transportation that just wasn't there when everyone was using horses.
It created the possibility, and the desire followed. So for Schumpeter, if we focus too much on changing consumer tastes, we miss the real story. We're studying the symptom, not the cause.
We'd be putting what we're trying to explain into our initial assumptions.
You'd be building it into the premises.
Yeah.
He wants to know where the dynamic force originates. And for him, it's not in the consumer sphere, it's in the production sphere. It comes from the ability and the sheer will to combine resources in a new way. The dynamism is on the supply side.
Okay, so let's dig into that process itself. Innovation. If development is all about new combinations, we have to be really precise about what that means.
Schumpeter's definition is very technical, but also very clear. He says innovation is a change in the production function. That's the theoretical map of inputs to outputs that can't be broken down into tiny steps. To produce is to combine things. So innovation is just combining them differently.
And he lays out 5 main ways this can happen, right? A new product, a new method of production.
A new market, a new source of supply, or a new way of organizing an industry, like creating or breaking up a monopoly.
So all of these fall under that new combination umbrella.
Yes. Whether it's the iPhone, which is a new product, or the assembly line, a new method, the fundamental economic act is the recombination of existing resources. And this brings us to what might be the single most critical distinction he makes: the difference between invention and innovation.
The idea versus the economic reality.
Yes, the dreamer versus the doer. An invention is the discovery of a new idea or a new technical process. It's a possibility. But Schumpeter is almost brutal in his assessment of its economic importance.
He says it's irrelevant.
Economically irrelevant, as long as it's not put into practice. A patent for a teleportation device sitting in a drawer does absolutely nothing for the economy.
And he says the skills required for each are totally different.
Completely different. Inventing is an intellectual act. It requires certain aptitudes. Carrying that invention into effect, innovating, requires an entirely different set of skills. Your inventor might be motivated by pure curiosity. The entrepreneur has a whole other set of drives.
He does say that an entrepreneur can be an inventor, like a Thomas Edison, but it's just a coincidence. It's not part of the job description.
It's not a requirement of the function. The truly economic act is the innovation. That's the application, the doing the thing, as he puts it. Without that, the inventive possibility is just dead.
It's the moment the new combination actually happens in the real world.
Right. Think about the steam engine. It was invented, in a sense, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. For decades, it was mostly just used to pump water out of mines. That was the invention.
But the innovation?
The innovation was when people figured out how to apply it systematically to textiles, to transportation, to mass manufacturing. That's what created new industries and destroyed old ones. The economic revolution wasn't the invention, it was the application.
And what makes this innovation so powerful, economically speaking, is that it doesn't wait around for new resources to magically appear. It puts immediate pressure on the resources we already have.
And this is so important for understanding the monetary side of his theory, which we'll get to. Innovation has to draw the means of production, the labor, the materials, from some old combinations.
Because in the circular flow, everything is already being used.
Everything is already allocated. There are no huge piles of idle steel or armies of unemployed engineers just waiting around. They're all busy doing their routine jobs.
So if I have a revolutionary idea for a new kind of factory, I need to hire engineers and buy steel that are currently being used for something else. I have to pull them away from the old way of doing things.
You have to, and that's his point. Development is primarily about employing existing resources in a different way. It isn't funded by the slow, steady trickle of new resources from population growth or normal savings.
He says those things are sources of growth, but they're just dwarfed by the sheer scale of reallocation that innovation causes.
Completely overshadowed. This is a direct shot at the classical idea that you have to wait patiently for savings and abstinence to build up new capital. Schumpeter is saying, no, development is, in the short run, a kind of zero-sum game for resources. You're not waiting for new chess pieces to be added to the board. You're violently rearranging the ones that are already there.
We're reshuffling the deck.
We are aggressively reshuffling the deck. And that subtle reallocation of existing labor and capital towards something new, that's the revolutionary act that creates all the disruption.
So if innovation is the process, the entrepreneur is the revolutionary agent. This is the person with the will and the ability to step outside that comfortable routine of the circular flow and actually introduce the new combination.
And just like with innovation, we really have to define the entrepreneur by what they are not.
Right. He's not the manager who's just executing orders based on demand.
He's not the capitalist who's just providing the money. And he's not the inventor who just comes up with the idea.
The entrepreneur is the catalyst, the one who connects the inventor's idea with the capitalist's money to make it a reality.
Their function is purely the will and the action to introduce that new combination. They are the leader, the decision maker, the one who takes the risk of buying up all these resources under conditions of, extreme uncertainty.
And this is why entrepreneurial profit exists, right? It's the specific reward for performing this unique, non-routine leadership role.
It's the return for breaking the equilibrium. And he makes this really interesting observation about competitive capitalism. He says new combinations are generally embodied in new firms.
The old companies are too stuck in their ways.
The forces of habit are just too strong. It's very rare for the guy who owns all the stagecoaches to be the one who decides to liquidate everything and build a railway.
Instead, some outsider, some new firm, comes along and builds the railway right next to his stagecoach line.
And eventually puts him out of business. That rise and fall of firms, of individuals, of families, that's a core feature of capitalism for Schumpeter. And it's a direct result of this discontinuous, lumpy nature of innovation.
It makes sense. If you're wildly successful doing things one way, your whole organization is built to resist a radical change.
Exactly. The old firms are trapped in their own circular flow. They're destined for what he would later call creative destruction, unless they can somehow learn to be entrepreneurial themselves. And this is why it takes a special kind of person. He argues that carrying out a new combination is objectively, psychologically, and socially very, very difficult.
Okay, let's break those three down. First, the objective difficulty. What makes it so much harder than just running a normal business?
Well, in the circular flow, you're sure of your ground. Every decision you make is based on past data, on precedent. You know what your costs are, you know your prices. When you innovate, all of that certainty just vanishes.
The familiar becomes unknown.
And habit which was your best friend, suddenly becomes a hindrance. The entrepreneur needs to find guidance where there is no guide. There's no historical data for a product that's never existed. It requires a kind of calculation that is more like intuition than routine management.
Okay, so that's the objective side. Then there's the psychological resistance. This is about breaking your own mental habits.
This is the internal battle. The forces of habit rise up, as he says, against the new idea. It takes another kind of effort of will to push through. Our brains are wired to follow the accustomed path because it's efficient for daily life.
It saves energy.
It saves energy. But for innovation, that efficiency is a drag chain. To overcome that inertia requires what he calls mental freedom, this huge surplus of energy and willpower. To turn a blueprint or a daydream into something real is a fight against your own comfort zone.
And finally, the social resistance. If you're introducing a radical change, you're basically threatening everyone who is successful in the old system.
Oh, absolutely. Deviating from the norm is often condemned. The entrepreneur faces opposition, sometimes ostracism, or even direct attack from those whose profits or influence are threatened by the new combination.
You can think of the guilds fighting against the first factories or, the political battles around ride-sharing apps today.
Exactly. Overcoming that resistance, convincing the skeptics, fighting the legal challenges, absorbing the initial losses, that's a special task that requires real leadership and resilience.
All of this seems to suggest that the standard economic model of Homo economicus, the rational guy trying to get the most reward for the least effort, that model just can't explain the entrepreneur. If the job is this hard, why do they do it? Why not just quit when you've made a lot of money?
And that is the absolute heart of Schumpeter's anti-hedonist argument. If entrepreneurs were just driven by maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, they'd logically stop once they had a big, comfortable income. The effort would start to outweigh the reward.
But they don't.
But they don't. Experience shows they retire only when their strength is spent. They keep chasing the next project even when they're already incredibly wealthy. So their motivation must be something other than pure economic gain. It must be anti-hedonist.
So what are these non-hedonist motives that he identifies? I think there are three main ones.
Three big ones. The first is the will to found a private kingdom or a dynasty. This is about the desire for power, for independence, for building something that lasts. Schumpeter calls it the modern equivalent of medieval lordship.
So it's not about the stuff the money can buy. It's about the control and the status that comes from building an empire.
Right. The second motive is all about competition.
The joy of the fight.
The will to conquer. The impulse to fight, to prove you're superior. For these individuals, economic action is akin to sport. It's a contest. And the financial result, the profit, isn't the goal itself. It's just the index of success.
It's the scoreboard.
It's the scoreboard that proves you won. The desire is for the struggle and the victory, and the money is just the proof.
And the third one seems to be the one he finds the purest.
I think so. It's the joy of creating, of getting things done. This is the sheer pleasure of building something new, of exercising your energy and ingenuity. It's the same impulse an artist feels, but applied to the economic world. They actually seek out difficulties because that's where the satisfaction is.
And this motive is the most anti-hedonist because the effort is the reward, not just a means to an end.
Exactly. So it's the combination of these three powerful non-economic drives, the desire for power, the love of the fight, and the joy of creation, that provides the psychological force needed to overcome all that resistance we talked about. It's what makes someone willing to smash the comfortable equilibrium of the circular flow.
They aren't trying to find equilibrium, they're trying to destroy it.
That's their entire function.
Okay, so we have our revolutionary agent, the entrepreneur, and the disruptive process, innovation. But a revolution needs resources. And this brings us to the final, and maybe the most technically difficult and controversial part of his theory, the role of credit and his attack on the traditional view of savings.
This where his dynamic theory slams right into monetary economics. The entrepreneur, as we've said, usually isn't the capitalist, so they need to get their hands on purchasing power to pull those resources away from the old combinations and into their new venture.
Why is this such a special act? I mean, why can't they just borrow the physical materials they need or just wait for people to save up more money?
Two reasons. First, remember the circular flow. There are no idle stocks of goods. The bricks, the steel, the labor, it's all already being used for something, so you can't just borrow the goods. And second, the entrepreneur can't finance the new project from past profits because, by definition, the project is new. It has no past profits.
So they need command over purchasing power right now.
Immediately. And this leads to the huge split between Schumpeter and more traditional economic theories, like the loanable funds theory, which basically says credit is just the transfer of money that someone else has already saved.
Schumpeter says credit is an act of creation.
That's the radical idea. Credit is the creation of purchasing power for the specific purpose of giving it to the entrepreneur. It is not, he insists, simply the transfer of existing purchasing power. The traditional bank is just an intermediary, taking deposits and lending them out. Schumpeter's bank is an active agent, creating new money, essentially out of thin air, to fund development.
So how does this new created money affect the system, especially if all the resources are already being used?
Well, when the bank grants that credit, it's acting like an order on the economic system to accommodate itself. The bank is giving the entrepreneur money that didn't exist in the system a moment ago. This injects new demand into the economy.
But the supply of resources is fixed, at least in the short term.
Right. So what has to happen? The prices of those resources, productive services, specialized labor, or raw materials, have to go up.
So the entrepreneur, with this new money from the bank, walks into the marketplace and just outbids the existing routine firms for the labor and materials they need.
That's the mechanism. He called it compression. The entrepreneur gets access to the resources because his newly created money can outbid the old money of the circular flow firms. Space for the innovation is literally squeezed out of the existing economy.
So if the entrepreneur bids up the wages for, say, software engineers by 30%,
Then the established companies that were relying on the old wage rate suddenly can't afford as many. They have to slow down projects, cut back, or raise their own prices. Their real purchasing power has been compressed.
so the entrepreneur is essentially forcing a reallocation by using targeted inflation in the input markets. The rest of the economy pays for the innovation through higher prices.
That is the core monetary insight. This credit-fueled disruptive mechanism is why development is inherently cyclical and, in its initial phase, inflationary.
And this leads us directly to his most famous and radical claim, the savings fallacy. He argues that savings are a consequence, not a cause, of development.
This puts him in direct opposition to, generations of economists. Schumpeter's argument is that the huge amount of social savings we see in a capitalist economy can only be explained by the results of previous development.
He doesn't think most savings come from the classic idea of thrift, people cutting back on their normal consumption.
No. He says by far the biggest chunk of savings comes from funds that are themselves the result of successful innovation. In other words, entrepreneurial profit.
So when an entrepreneur makes a huge fortune, the part of that fortune that isn't immediately spent isn't really saving in the traditional sense. It's just new wealth that's now available.
Exactly. It's not an encroachment upon the customary standard of life. That pool of reinvestable profit from successful ventures is gigantic compared to the small amount of savings that comes from a typical worker, putting aside a fraction of their regular static income.
And we can test this idea with his thought experiment. If we imagine a world where savings are the only thing driving change and there's no credit creation, what would that world look like?
Right. Let's build that model. The only change is saving, and money is just a fixed number of gold coins or something. Schumpeter says the system would just adapt smoothly. The new savings would push down the rate of interest just enough to make it worthwhile for some routine manager to borrow it for some tiny, predictable improvement.
Like buying a slightly more efficient machine, but not a revolutionary one?
Exactly. The low interest rate ensures the savings are absorbed without any drama. So a positive rate of saving would lead to a smooth, non-cyclical growth. Just a gentle upward glide path, no booms, no busts.
But that's not our world. Our world has the disruptive, discontinuous innovation that is financed by new credit, and that's what throws the system into chaos.
That new credit provides the explosive force that savings alone never could. He has this great term for the small, predictable savings of the circular flow. He calls it a goteo, which is Spanish for a trickle or a drip.
That's not enough to fund a revolution.
Not even close. If you build your model around that tiny trickle, you miss the flood of created credit that actually reshapes the entire economic landscape.
So to sum up the fallacy, savings are the fruit of yesterday's innovation, not the seed of tomorrow's.
It's a dynamic loop. Without development, there's no big profit. Without that profit, there are no massive savings. And so without development, you don't get the pool of capital that helps fuel the next round. The entrepreneur, powered by new credit, breaks through, generates a huge profit, and that profit becomes the main source of savings and capital for the next wave of innovators.
And this whole internal cyclical process is why capitalism evolves in this unbalanced, dissonant way. It looks less like a smooth transformation and more like a series of explosions, a business cycle.
And the credit mechanism is the engine room of that cycle. It's the source of the power that lets the entrepreneur make that leap. Without the banker being willing to create that purchasing power, the entrepreneur's brilliant idea just stays an idea. It's an irrelevant invention stuck in a garage somewhere.
Which brings us to the close of our deep dive into the Schumpeterian dynamic theory. We have moved from the static perfection of the circular flow through the defining characteristics of innovation to the driving anti-hedonist motives of the entrepreneur, and finally to the unique mechanism of credit creation that provides the necessary financial leverage.
We've really established his core idea that the economy is moved by these internal forces kicked off by special individuals who are fighting against the status quo and whose fight is made possible by the banking system's ability to create the purchasing power they need to reallocate the world's resources.
Innovation requires fuel. In our next episode, episode 4, we will analyze the vital monetary complement to the entrepreneur, credit creation, banking, and the monetary mechanism of Chapter 3, Part DE. But before we go, consider this provocative thought for your own observation. Schumpeter argued that the rise and fall of new firms, where the stagecoach owner rarely becomes the railway tycoon, is peculiar to competitive capitalism. If today we see massive technological incumbents like the big tech giants increasingly performing their own disruptive innovations and buying up smaller challengers, does the modern economy still rely on the dynamic outsiders Schumpeter described? Or are we witnessing the entrepreneurial function becoming successfully integrated and routinized within the very large firms they once sought to destroy?